Howdy, y'all. Professor Parks, PhD here. This is another in my series of the public talks that I have been a part of, either as an audience member or presenting them. In this case, I presented this particular talk at our Evening Under the Stars series. This talk was sometime last November. I will put the link to the entire public night experience down in the description. You can find it over on the GMU Observatory channel. As always, what I want to do with these is I want to snip out the talk part of it and leave off the visit to the observatory portion so that the talk itself can have more of a focus, because I attempt to find great speakers that provide relevant information. In this case, the relevant information concerns our attempts to go back to the moon. And so I was honored, deeply honored, and surprised when I was able to, when I contacted Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony, and she responded yes to my invite of giving a talk. Dr. Muir-Harmony is a graduate of MIT History Department. That's where she got her PhD. And her advisor was Owen Gingerich, one of the premier names in astronomical history. I have one of his books, Eye on Heaven, which talks about Copernicus, Ptolemy, and Kepler, and it's fantastic. It's actually kind of eye-opening. Dr. Muir-Harmony is the curator of the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Now, she had and still has a lot of work on her plate because of the recent renovations, but she did manage to carve out a little bit of time to give us a talk. And she's going to be talking about the history of the Apollo mission through the artifacts of that program. And so she's going to be showing a number of the pieces in that collection that are on display at the Air and Space Museum. And she is also going to display something I had not seen yet, because I have been to the Air and Space Museum quite a few times. And she's actually going to show you something that is in the new wing, that is in the new exhibit. But before I go on to that, I would also like to recommend her book. Her most recent book is Operation Moonglow. This is a history of the Apollo program as told from the political side of things. It details the progress of the space program from its inception in the late 50s through the Apollo program to Apollo 17. And it looks at the political motivations for why so much money was spent on making this a reality, on pushing the boundaries of human spaceflight so that we could land a person on the moon. It is an excellent read, and it was surprising to me. There were a few things that I suspected, but there was a lot of this. I did not truly appreciate the global scope of the Apollo missions from the advertising, from the engagement to other countries, and things of that nature. So again, I highly recommend it. Now, that's enough of me talking. I hope you enjoy this lecture or this talk, and I will see you next time. So, peace out and clear skies. Oh, and before I forget, as always, if you like this sort of content, I put out content on astronomy and mental health. If you like this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe. Howdy, y'all, and welcome to George Mason Observatory. My name is Dr. Rob Parks, and we are here for the Evening Under the Stars event. The way this event is going to work is that we're going to have a speaker who is graciously in person, and she will be speaking for 30, 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. And then we're going to break. The folks in person, we're going to take you up to the observatory, and I am dead set on seeing something through a telescope tonight. It may only be Jupiter, but we will be looking through the telescope at some point tonight. For those of you who are virtual, what we're going to do is one of our graduate students is going to give you essentially a virtual tour of our observatory and what we've been able to accomplish here and how we do things here. So one of the silver linings, as it were, of the pandemic is that it accelerated something that we've been wanting to do here for a while, which was to make our observatory remote. So previous to the pandemic, we would observe on the roof of this building, which you will soon see. The white part of the building is our control room, and that is where we would control the telescope. But now, like I said, because of certain circumstances, we are completely remote. So if you have the credentials, you have internet access, you are free to observe with our telescope wherever is convenient. Many of our students take advantage of that. Sadly, in my opinion, we have very few students who actually show up at our telescope and use it in person, which is kind of a sad turn of events. I often get asked what we can see with our telescope. And so those images that you see all around on the periphery are images that have been taken by students here at the university, or using the 32-inch telescope. And so those are some of the early events. What I'm very excited about is that the club is actually doing deep sky imaging. And what I mean by that is these are images where they take images for hours and then combine them. The one on the left is finished. That is the Cocoon Nebula, I believe, and I could be, I'm sure someone will correct me. I believe that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 hours worth of observations added together. And then the one on the right is currently a work in progress. It is a galaxy whom I'm ashamed to say that I have forgotten what its name is, but it is a face-on spiral galaxy. Both of these are incredibly faint objects. There is no chance for you to see them using your eye, and they would be very, very difficult to be able to see through an eyepiece, particularly with the light pollution that we have in our location. But this is what we can do here. This is the type of things, type of images that we can produce, and the sort of depth of field we can see. Doesn't compare to JWST, but hey, we do what we can. So as I said, this is Evening of the Stars. This is the last event of our semester, and I have to say that I'm very excited about our speaker. And so for me, we have saved the best for last. We will be starting up in spring, and we're currently working on those dates. We believe they're going to start early February, and we're hoping to be able to keep them on Tuesday evenings. As I said, this will be a 30-45-minute talk plus Q&A, and then we'll give a guided tour up on the roof. This is not a one-person operation here at our observatory. We have Dr. Peter Plavchan, who is the director of our observatory. Myself, I'm the deputy director. I am mainly concerned with the outreach portion of our observatory. But we are blessed this semester with not 2, but 4 graduate teaching assistants, one of whom is in our audience. This is Patrick. Two others are, I believe, online, Kevin and Em, and Mo could not be with us tonight. In addition, you're going to meet Jonathan, who has been instrumental in, has been very active with our telescope. He is an undergraduate, and he is the president of the Friends of the Observatory Astronomy Club here on campus, rapidly becoming one of the largest clubs that GMU has. Oh boy. Welcome, please. Let's see. There are a couple 3 seats in the front. Patrick, I hate to do this, Patrick, but oh no, all the other doors are locked. Apologize for that. This is a great crowd, so I guess we have that going for us. But anyway, so in the spring we will again be starting this back up with speakers. Speakers are to be determined or to be announced. Speaking of Friends of the Observatory, I know a number of my students are here today. So if you want to continue learning about astronomy beyond my course, I highly encourage you to become one of the Friends of the Observatory. They are a very active club, and they have a lot of perks, as it were, including use of the 32-inch telescope, pretty much unsupervised. I will be lurking around, but primarily they definitely have the prerogative to look at anything they want for as long as they, well, maybe not as long as they want, but for hours at a time, as I've already illustrated. They have monthly meetings, and they also have frequent day and nighttime activities. We have a solar telescope, so we can look at the sun during the day, and we have smaller telescopes which they take out onto campus and also do things in that way. Plus, they have started a sort of sub club where you can learn astrophotography. You can actually take images using our telescopes and combine them to make beautiful 3-color images. If you're just simply interested in what's going on with our observatory, I highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter, the Mason Observatory Outreach Newsletter, the Moon. You can find it at that website. In the Moon, we highlight particular students, we highlight the research that we do here, the events that will happen during the month, and when I actually get around to doing it, I also supply a space news column, which, given everything that is currently happening, I will have plenty of material for spring to work with, so which is good for me. So yes, I encourage you to look that up, to basically follow what we do here, and to just get a little bit of news as to what's going on. Now, as I said, I'm primarily in charge of our outreach program, and I am trying to enlarge it. What I would like to do is to be able to take our portable telescopes and portable planetarium out to places, high schools, elementary schools out in the surrounding counties that do not usually have or do not have the resources to have access to these materials. And of course, this requires a bit of funding. So if you're interested in contributing to that endeavor, I encourage you to become a patron of the observatory, which you can do at various levels. As you can see here, you can find all of this on our observatory website. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony. All right, good. Who is the historian and curator of the Apollo program or Apollo collection at the Smithsonian. She got her PhD at MIT in history, which at first I thought was a bit odd. I don't think of history and MIT going together, but considering her history is about space, the space age, it kind of clicked after that. Her work has been featured in a number of periodicals, from NPR to the Washington Post to the New York Times and so forth. She's also written a couple of books, one of which is right here, Operation Moonglow. I highly recommend it. It discusses how the political angle of the Apollo program and how the various presidential administrations looked at the Apollo program and how it influenced foreign policy. But tonight, she is going to be talking about the Apollo program, just the history of it, particularly just kind of from the ground up in various pieces in the collection, if I may. So if you give me a moment, I will switch over to her talk, and then we can get on with it.
And there are more seats up here. There are about 8 more seats. So please just come up and take a seat. Right. If you'd rather not sit on the ground.
I believe you're good to go. So the arrow key should work.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. This is an incredible group of people, especially at the end of the semester. So thanks for coming and spending your evening learning about the Apollo program. And hello, everyone online. Okay, I'll jump right into it. So yeah, so I'm the curator of the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian. I have a few thousand artifacts in my collection. Many of them you can see at the Muir-Harmony Center, at the downtown location of the museum, which just reopened the West End. Hopefully you've come down and seen it, or you're planning on coming to visit it soon. And then we also have many artifacts on loan at museums throughout the country and the world, actually. So, but tonight I'm going to tell the history of the Apollo program and early space exploration through some of the artifacts at the museum. once I figure out how to advance the slide. Okay.
So the arrow key should work.
Perfect. Okay. So this is where I'll start. So often we began talking about the space age with Sputnik in October 1957, but I like to start here with Vanguard TV3. This is in our collection. Does anyone have a sense of how this mission went? Yeah, it didn't go so well. That's a great guess. It didn't go so well. So it was a disaster, actually. So the US tried to compete with the Soviet Union by launching this satellite into space shortly after the Soviet Union got that first satellite into space in October 1957 with Sputnik. It was a failure. It was a huge embarrassment to the United States. They had brought the press in to cover it, so everyone knew that it exploded on the launch pad. It was discarded to the side. The Smithsonian's very happy to have it in the collection, but at the time it was not seen as a very positive thing. And it was part of what kicked off the space race. So this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, it was part of this larger competition of the Cold War at that time. The US and the Soviet Union were competing for global influence. The United States was trying to demonstrate that democracy was the best political system and to promote capitalism internationally. The Soviet Union was promoting socialism as a political system. And this was also at a time when there was many newly independent nations. So the end of colonialism and the establishment of new nations and countries that were considering which superpower to align with. So the US and the Soviet Union, they were competing for the hearts and minds of the world public. Both looked to spaceflight as part of that mission, and it was seen as valuable. So not only when it comes to soft power, but then also national security as well. So this was all happening within that context. And so the United States was really concerned after this failed mission and continued to compete with the Soviet Union throughout the remainder of the 1950s and the 60s and the 1970s. So here's another example. This is from the Postal Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian, but I like showing these stamps because it shows some of the competition. You can see a Soviet stamp there and an American stamp. And any comments on what's different about these two stamps? What do you see? Fair point, yes. So why does it look cooler? Spikes, okay, yeah. Yeah, and it's more something of the imagination. So it reflects more like maybe what you'd see in science fiction or when you dream of spaceflight, what you think of. And the US stamp is actually based on the engineering drawings from a Mercury spacecraft. And so what the United States really tried to do with its space program is share a lot of information. So launches were broadcast, press had information about the spacecraft, about all the missions, about the astronauts. And so this stamp was actually designed off of the engineering diagrams of the hardware. Now, the Soviet Union was keeping information about its spacecraft under wraps, and it wasn't shared for many years. Part of this was because the Soviet Union's initial designs for human spaceflight required the cosmonaut to eject from the spacecraft before it crashed into the Earth, and there was concern that that might not count as a successful human spaceflight. But they went with a different approach, and so didn't share as much information with the world as the United States did. And then this played into also how they communicated their space programs, what they emphasized. So the Soviet program, you can see cool, it looks like something of the imagination. The US program, you can actually see what the spacecraft looked like. That this one was based on John Glenn's orbital space flight. So that last stamp with the Soviet one, that was done in honor of Yuri Gagarin's flight. Now that's the first human space flight. It was a Soviet Union accomplishment, again, a Soviet first in the space race. The United States also had a human space flight program, but it was lagging behind a little bit. After Gagarin's flight, President Kennedy asked his advisors what the United States could do that would be highly impressive to the international public. That's how he put it. They came back with a suggestion to send humans to the moon, land them, and return them safely back to the Earth before the end of the decade. And Kennedy decided to pursue this goal. This was Project Apollo, and it was seen for Kennedy primarily within political terms, within the context of the Cold War, and what the United States had to do to compete with the Soviet Union on the international stage. This is a really brief overview of Apollo. So it's an extraordinary program. It was the largest civilian technological program in US history. At the time, it cost $25 billion. With inflation, it's about 280 billion, so it's over 4% of the federal budget. By the mid-1960s, you saw hundreds of thousands of people employed across the country and across the world. It was a massive, massive undertaking. And when Kennedy proposed it in May of 1961, the US had only 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience with a brief suborbital flight by Alan Shepard. You can see a spacecraft at the Smithsonian. So it was an extraordinarily bold proposal, but Congress supported it and invested in it. And it was a mobilization sort of on the scale of how you would mobilize for a war. And then these are, a few facts and figures there. So 24 astronauts have gone to the moon. That's it. That's still the number to this day. And 12 astronauts have walked on the lunar surface. But since 1972, no human has been more than 400 miles from Earth. That might change shortly with the Artemis program, which we can talk about during question and answer if you're interested. So as I mentioned, 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience, which meant the United States had a lot of work to do before they would land humans on the moon before the end of the decade. And so one of the things that was necessary was this massive rocket, the Saturn V. It's a multi-stage rocket. There are 3 stages. It was the most powerful, the largest rocket ever built. The SLS now surpasses it in terms of thrust, but it's still the largest, most successful rocket that's been produced when it comes to the kind of missions that it had to serve. So these deep space missions. And you can see a diagram there. Now the spacecraft sat at the very top of it, and it's a multi-part spacecraft. I'll get into this. So at the very, very tip top is the command module. Now this is the Columbia. You can see this downtown at the Air and Space Museum. So this is the command module from the Apollo 11 mission in particular, but each of the missions had a command module, and this was basically the astronauts' home throughout the mission. This is where they spent most of their time, but it was also their lab. They did experiments in there. It was the whole space they basically lived in on their way to and from the moon. And it's about 11 feet by 13 feet roughly, and 210 cubic feet for the interior living space. So relatively compact. And there was a 3-person crew on each of the missions. And what you can see here is a lot of the wear and tear on the heat shield on the exterior. But I'll skip through that development unless people are interested in the heat shield. And this is the interior of that command module. So you see over 500 switches and buttons. And to point a few things out, how would I do this? So if you see that line of the 3 like black buttons there, that's the diski, that's basically the computer. And that was how you interacted with the computer for the mission. Other things of note below that, switches for abort, stuff like that. So at the very bottom of the picture, what you see, those brown things, those are what were called couches, or basically seats. And each of the astronauts sat in those seats, and the control panel would be at arm's length. And during the flight, they would fold up those seats so they would have a little bit more space in the command module. But during launch, they would sit in those seats. There's 3 seats, 3 seats, so 3 astronauts. And this is the command module as you can see it in our new exhibit. So we just reopened the west end of the museum, and we have an exhibit called Destination Moon, and it looks at the history of lunar exploration. So this is where the command module sits now, right next to Neil Armstrong's spacesuit. So this is another part of the spacecraft. This is the lunar module, and the lunar module is a two-part spacecraft in itself. And so there's the ascent stage and the descent stage. So basically what happened is that the astronauts would fly the command module with a service module with the lunar module to the orbit of the moon. And then and one astronaut would stay inside the command module while two astronauts landed on the lunar surface in the lunar module. They would do their spacewalk, and then they would get back into the lunar module, and then the top stage of it would launch from the moon, rejoin the command module in lunar orbit, and then they would return to Earth. This is the LM2, Lunar Module 2. So this is, you can see this at the Smithsonian, although it's not currently on display because of our renovation. But it was designed to fly. It wasn't needed for Earth orbital tests. So we kept it on Earth, tested it on Earth, and then put it on display. And there you can see what the lunar module looks like on the moon. And then in addition to building all this new hardware, we had to also build up our expertise when it came to rendezvous and docking and spacewalks and long duration spaceflight. So there was Project Gemini, which is really essential to learning how to live and work in space. The longest mission there was 2 weeks long, which was basically the length of an Apollo mission, the longest Apollo mission. And so this was another important component of preparing for sending humans to the moon. So I'm going to run through a series of missions sort of quickly to focus on Apollo 11. But starting in 1968, there was Apollo 7. This was an Earth orbital mission to test hardware. Then we have Apollo 8, the first mission to the moon. It did not land. It orbited the moon and then brought back this extraordinary photo, Earthrise, which is now one of the most famous and most reproduced photos ever taken. And you can see the camera that took that at the Air and Space Museum. And then we have 9 and 10, which are also missions to test out the hardware. 10 was considered a dress rehearsal mission. So it went through much of what ended up happening on Apollo 11, the first lunar landing mission, which we'll talk about now. By July 1969, the United States was ready to fulfill Kennedy's proposed mission of sending humans to the moon and landing them there safely before the end of the decade, got in right before the end of the decade. So the crew launched on July 16th, 1969. You can see them there. You have Neil Armstrong all the way on your left, then Mike Collins, the command module pilot in the center. He was the one that stayed inside the spacecraft orbiting the moon, and then Buzz Aldrin there on your right. But I think it's important to mention that there was a lot of critique for the Apollo program, the cost of the Apollo program, that it was a national priority, especially within the United States. And actually, although we often remember it as a very popular program, less than half of Americans were supportive of Project Apollo and thought it should be a major national priority. And it was only around the first lunar landing that more than half of Americans thought this is what the United States should be doing. And so this artifact is an example of some of the critique of the Apollo program. So around the time of the launch for the first lunar landing, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference held a protest at Kennedy Space Center. And they were really concerned about government priorities. And they thought that that the government should be spending more on helping with housing and urban issues, and what they had something called the Poor People's Campaign. And so they used this as a moment to draw lots of attention to their movement. And they spoke with the NASA administrator, and he said, if I didn't launch the astronauts to the moon tomorrow and it could solve these problems, then I wouldn't launch them, but it won't, but we should work together. And so there was an important dialogue there, but there was also, I bring it up mainly because there was a bit of critique. And This is a contribution can that's in the Smithsonian Museum for African American History and Culture. And this, the SCLC was initially led by Martin Luther King Jr., although it was Ralph Abernathy who was leading that protest in 1969. So the astronauts launched on the way to the moon. They landed the lunar module. There's a lot to that story. And they had a little break before they went out on the lunar surface, and they had a meal. So this is the first meal on the moon. Bacon squares tend to be the most popular food from the Apollo program. The astronauts love them. When you're in space, the fluids in your body, they collect in your nasal cavity. You can't taste as well. You can't smell as well. So spicy, salty things are really more appealing. So bacon squares were on that first menu on the lunar surface. It's a light meal. It's more like a snack, and they had a larger meal later, but they ate this. Buzz Aldrin performed communion on the moon before they went on the lunar surface. So they had a little bit of time, and then they made their way for the first steps on the moon. And here you can see, this is actually Buzz Aldrin, but you know, the descent down the ladder of the lunar module. And what I want to point out here is this is where the camera was located. So an important part of this mission was sharing those first steps with people all around the world. This was the first truly live global television broadcast in history. So over 500 million people watched in unison these first steps. And this is part of how they did it, because they had mounted this camera on the outside of the lunar module to follow those first moments on the moon. And so Neil Armstrong took the step. He said those famous words. And I want to say something quickly about his spacesuit. So one of the interesting elements of the spacesuit, there's a lot to it, but the mission patch, which you can see in a picture here, each of the crews was given the responsibility of designing their mission patch. And Mike Collins led this one up. And one of the things that's important about this patch is it doesn't include the names of the astronauts. And so these usually, if you see other missions, they'll include the last names of the astronauts. To this day, that's what they do. But the Apollo 11 crew, they said they wanted this to be more universal. They wanted it to be more inclusive. It's not just about them. And they also decided to write out Apollo 11, as opposed to the word 11, they wanted the numerals because I thought it would be more accessible to people who didn't speak English. And so they wanted this to be something that was representative of all humankind and not necessarily the crew of three or even the United States. And they decided initially this eagle was not carrying this olive branch, and they added it to make him seem more peaceful. And the picture here is from a National Geographic bird book. And so they actually just traced that eagle out of the bird book for the patch. And then they made it look a little friendlier because the feedback was that it looked too frightening. A fun little fact about this is they actually got the shadow on the Earth wrong. If you remember from the Earthrise photo, that shadow should not be on that side of the Earth when you're looking at it from the lunar surface, but it is what it is, and it remains that way to this day. Okay, and here's Neil Armstrong's spacesuit when it was just reinstalled at the museum downtown. It has a really special mannequin inside of it that circulates the air. Because the materials are actually degrading the spacesuit, it's sort of eating away at itself, because spacesuits were designed to keep astronauts safe on the lunar surface, not necessarily to last for decades and decades. And so we have this special interior structure that circulates the air to help ensure that the spacesuit will last as long as possible. It will not last forever, so make sure you go see it. No, it's going to last for a while. It'll be in good condition for a while, but it won't last forever. And that's one of the issues that we have to deal with when it comes to these space objects, is they're designed for particular purposes that aren't necessarily lasting a very, very long time. And a lot of new materials were developed that aren't quite as stable or corrode or have some issues like the spacesuits. But the spacesuits tend to be some of the most vulnerable artifacts, so we have to take special care of them. Here's a picture from the lunar surface. So Aldrin was on the surface for about 20 minutes, and then he was joined by Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz Aldrin claims another first. So Armstrong, first human to walk on the lunar surface. Aldrin claims he was the first human to urinate on the lunar surface. No one's contested that. They let him have that claim. But unfortunately, what happened is his urine collection device, and you can see what it looks like here, broke. And supposedly his boot filled up. And so it was a sort of sloshy first few steps for him on the lunar surface. But this is a urine collection and transfer assembly. And one of the reasons I like sharing this when I talk about Apollo artifacts is it's also a good reminder that the crews were all men, and these things like this were designed for men's bodies. So it's a reminder of some of the larger context of those missions. And the Soviet Union sent a woman into space 20 years before the United States did that. It's, I think, an important part of that story. So moving along, let me see. So their EVA was roughly 2.5 hours long. They spent a little less than 24 hours on the lunar surface. By Apollo 17, the astronauts would spend 3 days on the lunar surface, so much, much longer missions. And in total, all those lunar landing missions, all 6, collected about 840 pounds of lunar samples, which is a really important part of the science that was done on the Apollo program. These are examples of some of the tools they would use to collect those samples. These are from training, but you can get a sense of what those tools are like. So their spacesuits were really bulky and they're pressurized. And so these are specially designed to help them collect material. And this is a sort of funny artifact from Apollo 14. So astronaut Alan Shepard had this great idea. He thought, why not take one of these collection sample devices and adapt it and make it into a golf club. And so he actually went golfing on the moon. So all he had to do was bring the head of the golf club, and then it was especially attached to a lunar collection sample device. Here is an example of the containers that they would use to return these lunar samples back to Earth. They were padded. A great story from Apollo 11 is that they had collected all the samples that they had intended to collect. Neil Armstrong noticed there's some extra space in this rock box. And so he took a shovel and just filled it up with a bit more lunar material. And that actually ended up being some of the most significant samples collected during the Apollo program, is that he happened to pick up a really good soil sample there. And you can see the rocks being studied at the Lunar Receiving Lab in Houston, Texas. So moving along, there were other experiments that they did, or other science that was done on the moon. So for Apollo 11, they had the early Apollo surface experiments package. Later missions had a similar type of thing, but a bit more elaborate because those missions were longer. But there were a variety of experiments that were used to learn about the solar wind. They set up, later missions set up a telescope on the moon, actually, which we have at the museum. So make sure to come and see that. But a variety of different experiments. They were interested in whether or not there were moonquakes, much like earthquakes, but moonquakes, so the composition, the deeper composition of the moon as well. Here's an example I wanted to share with this group. So the laser ranging retroreflector, because observatories play an important role in this story. So what would happen is they set this up on the lunar surface, and an observatory can basically shoot a laser at the moon, and it gets reflected back, and that helps you determine a variety of things like the exact distance from the Earth to the moon. And then also it's helped us learn about how the moon is slowly receding from Earth. And you can still do it. Actually, during the 50th anniversary, there were observatories that still use the retroreflector. And it was the Lick Observatory that made the first successful measurements using this retroreflector on the lunar surface. And so it was August 1st that they were able to do that. And that mission was July 20th. So it was relatively soon that they figured it out. And then there was the last series of missions, which we're coming up on the anniversary for Apollo 17 in December this year. So that's the 50th anniversary. So we're nearing the end of the 50th anniversaries of these Apollo program missions. These were longer stays on the lunar surface. They included the lunar rover, which you can see a picture of here. And there was a lot more science done on these missions. So this is a favorite artifact from the collection. Anyone have an idea what this might be? This is a tricky one. It's a good idea. Not quite. Yes, that lunar rover. So this is it in context. So they had this problem with the lunar rover. Each of the missions, they kept on ripping off the fender by accident with their tools. And this is a huge problem because the lunar soil is really rough, really jagged. It can really embed itself in the spacesuits. It can scratch the helmets. It can overheat equipment. It's really, really hard to clean off when you between EVA, so getting back into the spacecraft. And so this actually could be potentially deadly. They had to figure out a solution so that when they rode around in the lunar rover, it wouldn't shoot up so much dust and make such a mess and put them at risk. And so what the astronauts did is they called down to mission control. They told them the problem. Then the astronauts went to sleep, and then the engineers in mission control looked at all the material they had on board and came up with this solution. And so they realized they had extra lunar maps they didn't need in that area. They had duct tape because they always had duct tape on board, and then they had these clamps. And so they made this the next morning. They told the astronauts how to do it. They made it. They clamped it on, and it worked really well. And thankfully, the astronauts decided to bring it back to Earth with them at the end of the mission. So we have this in the collection too. But it's fun because you can see it's very dirty still with lunar dust, which is very cool. This is another wonderful thing that was brought back on that Apollo 17 mission. And this is the blue marble image. Has anyone seen this before? Yeah, it is one of the most, like Earthrise, one of the most reproduced images ever. It made a large impact. It was published in newspapers around the world. It was used in a lot of the environmental movements, imagery and flags and banners and all sorts of things on the Whole Earth catalog, if you've heard of that. So it became incredibly impactful, and it was one of the important things brought back from the Apollo missions in addition to all those lunar samples. And this is the camera that took it, to give you a sense. These are Hasselblad cameras that took many of those really important images. It's a camera made in Sweden. And it's worth noting that some of the astronauts said they went to the moon and the most important thing that they discovered was Earth and an appreciation for Earth. And so having these cameras helped them share that appreciation with people back on Earth. I'm showing you all my favorites. This is another favorite. And sometimes I say this is my favorite artifact in the collection. And so when Neil Armstrong went to the moon, they were able to bring some things along with them. And Buzz Aldrin, as I mentioned, took communion on the moon. So he brought things to take communion on the moon, like a wafer and some wine. Buzz Aldrin took pieces of the Wright brothers airplane with him to the moon. And he wanted to connect that first airplane flight with that first lunar landing. And he did that through bringing an artifact with him to space. And so for someone who appreciates artifacts, a museum curator, I think that this is really significant because it tells us a bit about the important role that objects play in our life, and also our experiences and making history as well. So he, by bringing that artifact, connected that first airplane flight with that first lunar landing forever. And this is on display. And another example of that, sort of the power of artifacts and objects. So a handful of years ago, Jeff Bezos decided to go find the F1 engines from the Apollo 11 mission that had fallen to the ocean floor. So as I mentioned, the Saturn V rocket, that's a multi-stage rocket. So after that first stage was expended, about 35 miles up, it dropped down, hit the Atlantic Ocean, sunk to the floor, where it stayed for decades and decades. And he thought that if he could find them, if he could bring them back up, if people could see them, it would be impactful to them. Apollo inspired him. It's been a big part of his interest in space, but also science and technology. So he wanted to share that with other people. So he went to go find them, and they found them. Luckily, it was a successful mission, and they're put on display. So we have them at the museum now for the first time. You can see the installation of these pieces from that mission. And now they are there, and you can really see the impact of hitting the ocean surface, and then also sort of existing on the ocean floor for many decades after that. I'll end there with a picture of the far side of the moon. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thanks for your attention. Yeah.
We can give a very long applause. And I'm going to take prerogative of the MC prerogative and ask the first question. Is it true that you have actually sat down with all 3 of the Apollo 11 astronauts?
Yes, it is. I've been very lucky. Yes, all 3.
So, who's your favorite?
Oh my goodness, that's an unfair question. But I will say, I am so appreciative of Mike Collins. So he's the command module pilot. He became the director of the Air and Space Museum in the 1970s and helped the completion of that building and ensured that we collected all these important artifacts from the Apollo program. He's been really wonderful to work with. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of my research focuses on the politics of spaceflight, and he actually ended up joining the State Department after being an astronaut, because he was so sort of inspired by the astronauts' diplomatic work after their mission. They went on this global tour. It was really impactful to him. So he did that. And so I organized an event with him and Buzz Aldrin for the 50th anniversary. And it was just spectacular. So I greatly appreciate him, but they're all really remarkable people in their own right. And I will not pick a favorite. Just like the artifacts, I'll just say they all are my favorite.
Yeah, I can't imagine actually sitting down with particularly any one of them. All 3. So yes, anyone in the audience? I think you, sir.
There's might be 2 separate questions, but I've heard 2 weird but true rumors about some of the things that might happen on the moon. One was that due to solar radiation, the flag we put there is kind of a white flag, so the moon is constantly surrendering. Is that true?
That is true. Yes. Yeah. So we actually have 6 flags on the moon for each of the missions. One got knocked over when the astronauts were taking off, but yeah, solar radiation has bleached them white, and we actually have evidence of that from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So we have photographed the sites and have a good sense that those flags are now white. Yeah. All the materials, the trash, everything's still there.
I've heard at one point was that they were so terrified that if they were on the moon, they couldn't get them back up, if they had fallen down, that the situation was at any point you get down, try and roll over if you can, just if you're on the back, or you can get.
I haven't heard that if you're on your back, we're leaving you there part. What I know about NASA is they probably wouldn't have given up that easily, but it actually was extraordinarily dangerous to fall down. And that was something that they were concerned. So it looks, when you see the videos, it's very playful and they're hopping around, but that's because of that is actually a very effective way to get around in a stiff spacesuit, that bunny hop. But they had to be very careful. They didn't want to fall down. They didn't want to puncture their spacesuit, although it has roughly 20 layers. It is a spacesuit in the vacuum of space, and so they had to be extraordinarily careful, and it was difficult to get up. But I imagine that they would have come up with a solution before they just said, goodbye. But related to some of the risks that were taken, another story I like sharing is that President Nixon actually wrote a speech in case the Apollo 11 mission was a failure. So he had it ready to go ahead of time. He had protocol ready to go to call the astronauts' wives, to console them. And so he would, the chance of the mission being a failure was something that everyone took really seriously, and each of the subsequent missions as well. And you never really know like what the probability of success is, but with Apollo 8, that first lunar orbital flight, they had said that, you know, it's like 1/3 chance they'll die, 1/3 chance that it'll fail, but they'll still come back alive, and 1/3 a chance it'll be a success. Those are really bad odds. But they also were really good at finding solutions when problems did arise.
Probably usually involve duct tape.
Duct tape factors in more than once in these stories, which is great.
Any other? Listen, so why did we stop going?
So there are a variety of reasons. It is extraordinarily expensive. That's a big part of this. And this is something that requires a major national investment, or it has up to this point. And so it's not a matter just of interest. It's also about congressional will. And it's also about the political value of that type of investment. And Kennedy and Johnson saw the benefits of that. And Nixon, although he really did appreciate the sort of the political boost of the Apollo program and the enthusiasm and how it served his foreign relations agenda, he tried to find a program that was more cost effective. And so a big part of the reason they canceled some of the missions was just because they needed a space program that was more sustainable financially. And if you look at the numbers, it was an extraordinary investment at that time, and it was hard to sustain that level of investment long term. But it's also worth noting that other presidents have proposed lunar exploration programs. So George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And one of the problems you see with programs like this is often it takes multiple administrations or long timelines to achieve these kinds of really challenging programs. Today we're seeing with Artemis a lot of sustained support over different administrations and a lot of bipartisan support in Congress. So it's looking like the potential for returning to the moon now is much greater than it had been in the past. Yeah, so we were just chatting a little bit about some of the similarities and differences with the Artemis program. So we have the Artemis 1 mission. It's a test mission of the hardware going on right now, and it's worth noting there's some artifacts on the mission. So NASA contacted the Smithsonian to talk about what makes sense to fly. And we'll collect some things from that mission. And then Artemis 2, which will come up in a few years, will be more like a lunar flyby mission. And then Artemis 3 hopefully will send humans to the lunar South Pole. And then eventually there will be a more sustained presence on the lunar surface. It's still unclear fully to what extent, if there will be a gateway space station, but there's a lot of great plans in the works, and we'll see how everything goes. But in relationship to the Apollo program, I like emphasizing that the budget of Artemis is much more resembles the space shuttle program than it does the Apollo program. It's not this massive national investment like you saw with Apollo. So NASA's budget for many years has been about 0.5% of the federal budget, and that's everything NASA does, not just human spaceflight, although human spaceflight's a big chunk of that, and Apollo was over 4%. So these are programs on very, very different scales. With the Artemis program, there some differences in terms of it's much more inclusive. So the plan is to have the first woman walk on the lunar surface, I think also first minority, first person of color is maybe how they put it. So those are
going to be 2 separate people.
they haven't announced it yet. This is NASA, yeah. So those are some differences. And then there's also the difference in politics. And so President Kennedy was really interested in figuring out how to improve the United States' place on the world stage, especially after Gagarin's flight and the Bay of Pigs, which I hadn't mentioned, but that was part of his motivation as well. With the Artemis program, it's interesting. It has a much longer legacy. Some of the hardware dates back to the George Bush administration, the spacecraft itself. The rocket has a longer legacy too. It can be traced back to the Obama administration with the interest in going to an asteroid. And so a lot of this technology has been adapted for this new mission, but there's this longer sustained interest, and it's really also received a lot of support by Congress. So it's less of a presidential initiative than you saw with the Apollo program, and more congressional initiative. And so could go on and on and on, but those are some of the similarities and some of the differences between the programs. It's also on a different time frame. So although when it was initially announced, Artemis did have a really tight time frame, it wasn't expected that we would meet that necessarily, that we don't have to rush to get there. We're not in a Cold War.
Is there any private government shared collaborative program during cancer?
So one really important thing to note, we hear a lot about new space and the commercialization of spaceflight. And with the Apollo program, over 90% of the people who worked on Apollo were contractors and subcontractors. And a similar percentage of the budget to Apollo went to private industry. And so it was an important public-private partnership from the very start. The contracting process was a bit different with the Apollo program than we see today with how NASA works with SpaceX. But industry played a really essential role in the entire history of American space exploration. And so with the Artemis program, industry continues to play a really important role, and have contracted for things like the lunar lander, for instance. And so all these components are being developed and designed in close cooperation between NASA and industry.
So kind of piggybacking on, sorry, Jonathan, I'll get you this. Kind of piggybacking on that, for some reason, one of my favorite things to do is to engage with science deniers, including people who don't believe we went to the moon. One of the things they like to bring up is the Saturn V rocket. They claim that we lost the technology for it. Is that true? Like what happened with the Saturn V rocket?
I don't believe we lost the technology. We actually have two that weren't used that you could just go look at. If you want to check them out, they weren't flown because of these canceled missions. We have a lot of information about different components of the Apollo spacecraft. And interestingly enough, though, I do hear from people working on the Artemis program who are interested in the technology that we have on exhibit and we have in storage at the Smithsonian, and curious how they designed things back then. And so we do share a lot of information, but there's a lot of, you do hear with conspiracy, there's a sort of sense of like everything was lost or erased, but I don't think that is so much of an issue. I see a raised hand online.
Oh, yeah. Forgot there was virtual.
Right. Okay. So the official transcript of Neil Armstrong's words, there's a recent stuff that just came out about that. I think that there's been a lot of debate. There's been investigation of whether or not, I don't know if you all know this issue, but he said one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And there's this question of whether or not he said one small step for man or one small step for a man. So the article is really important to make sense, to communicate what he wanted to communicate with that message. I think his intention is clear. And so I tend to focus more on what he intended to say, which is that it was a small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, or I would edit it to humankind now. But there's been analysis of the audio to see whether or not he actually says it. And I think people think it's not there, but I don't know. I don't know actually how much it matters in the end when you know what his intention was.
Well, thanks very much. I plan to ignore the the anything but what it sounds like it should have said. So thank you.
I got a disagreement online, I guess.
No, I agree.
It's interesting.
I agree, absolutely.
if you go to the exhibit at the Air and Space Museum, we have the quote up alongside the his spacesuit, and the article is left out of it. And that is the thing I think we've gotten the most feedback from so far from visitors, because people have very strong feelings about that article. I'm okay either way. But one of the things I think it is important to recognize is when you put that in the context of how Armstrong spoke about the mission in general, about all of the speeches he gave around the country and around the world, he really wanted to emphasize that this was something that was for all humankind, that it was something that we were doing together. And that was a big part of the messaging that NASA was putting out, the State Department was putting out, and that also the ways that people were talking about these missions was that it was something that humanity did. And people felt like they were part of the mission. So the astronauts traveled the world after their flight. They did this whirlwind tour around the world. And they said the most surprising thing for them was that everywhere they went, people didn't say, you know, congratulations, you did it, but they said, we did it. So there was a sense of participation among many of the people they encountered around the world. And that was in part because these people were able to watch those first steps on television. They were able to read about it in the newspaper or hear it on the radio in their own language. And but then also Armstrong said things like that. So there was a great emphasis that this was something for all humankind, as opposed just like an American accomplishment or the accomplishment of Armstrong himself. So I think that his phrase should be put in that context. But you go any which way.
I think we have time. Oh, Art.
Yeah, are other countries trying to go to the moon right now?
Yeah, so actually tomorrow, or like in the middle of the night tonight, depends on when you wake up. I believe a rover is being launched to the moon by a SpaceX rocket. It's a Japanese program. So that's an example that's happening this week. But there are plans for also other human missions to the moon, crewed missions, and Russia and China have plans to build a lunar base together. Now, given everything that's going on in the world today, it's hard to know what the timeline of that will be, if it'll happen, but there have been announced plans that is what they hope to do, and the future of their crewed spaceflight program. But we'll definitely see many more launches and things like that of rovers and probes of various sorts. Yeah.
Let me check real quick. Do we have any other questions online? No. Let's take that one and these two that I saw, and then we will wrap up and go to the talk.
Person's very happy with you. That's a good question.
Okay, good. So outreach, what we can do to share information about what's happening. One of the things I like to point out about the Apollo program, and that was different about Apollo than Artemis, for instance, is that when the United States invested in Apollo, we didn't just invest in the development of hardware, we invested in this massive public relations campaign that spanned the globe. And it was the largest public relations campaign in history that went alongside the lunar exploration program. And that was in part because Kennedy saw the mission of Apollo wasn't just sending humans to the moon, it was also winning the hearts and minds of the world. And when you see how he originally proposes it to Congress, he's very explicit about that. So getting that information out was essential. And so the US government was invested in getting that information out with the US Information Agency, which no longer exists, but basically was an agency designed to spread information about the United States internationally. They work closely with the State Department, but they ensured that people in places that didn't have access to TV for the mission, they ensured that they would have radio access, or they actually had mobile vehicles that they attached screens to, and they projected space films while they played the live audio of the first lunar landing. And there was so much work that went into ensuring that people could follow the flight, had the information. They sent out press packets. They did that domestically too. NASA sent out press packets. You could be a kid and you could get that information, you could write in. But there was a lot of work and investment that went into the public relations of spaceflight. And I think that that was an important part of that era, and what distinguishes it. Also, it was brand new. So first satellite 1957, humans on the moon 1969. It's sort of, when you think of like where you were over the past 10 years, thinking of that kind of change within that short period of time, you can understand why it captured attention and imagination. But I think that not just NASA, but the US government more generally, or others, could invest in the promotion and education related to spaceflight. And so it would take more than just the work within NASA and the work at a place like the Smithsonian, but it would have to take sort of increased interest and effort to support those institutions to communicate with the public and with people around the world. But we do a lot of it also. I mean, there's a lot being done, and hopefully you're all following the Artemis mission and some of the other great work like the James Webb Space Telescope, which is absolutely exciting. Good, good.
Over here.
You said earlier that Jeff Bezos works to recover the Apollo aliens and that you have funds that happening. And I was wondering, did you donate them, or even when they were like in the ocean, were they still property with like up now?
Yeah, it's this tricky thing. So it was a bit, yeah. So they were NASA's property, and the Smithsonian has a relationship with NASA. When when they no longer need their hardware, it's offered to us, and we can collect it. And this was something that was established in the 1960s when it became clear to NASA that they were creating all this material that was going to be very historic. And so, and they knew the Smithsonian would be an institution that could take care of it. And so we collected a lot of material, and we continue to have this relationship to this day. And so when he recovered these artifacts, of course, you know, we got involved in it. They were conserved at the Kansas Cosmosphere, which does incredible conservation work. And then we collected the Apollo 11 components, but there were other components that were recovered, and those are in other places like the Seattle Museum of Flight, which he has close ties with in the Seattle area. So he didn't have to donate them all. We worked with him and NASA and to ensure that they would go on display.
One final question. I think it was over here. Yes.
With your background in the politics of spaceflight, are we in a space race with China? If so, what would be the political objectives for this?
So I don't think we're in a space race with China. And one of the important differences is that the first original, the space race was, it wasn't just to beat the Soviet Union, it was to beat the Soviet Union in front of the world. And it was about political alignment. It was about political influence. It was about the United States' approach to global power, right? And so it was a strategy that prioritized public opinion. It prioritized soft power. It saw spaceflight as an important role within this larger approach to how the United States fought the Cold War. Now, not only do we not have a Cold War anymore, but it's unclear what competing with China will do. So if eventually it makes a difference, whether it's domestically in terms of national identity. So we need to think of ourselves as, the premier space faring nation, or if it's about, embarrassment in front of the world. But we have to really care about what that competition will mean, whether or not it's domestically or internationally. And at this point, the United States invests incredible amounts in space exploration. And so when it comes to spaceflight, we spend something like roughly 4 times what China spends, talking about military space as well, not just civilian. But we don't have a precise estimate of the amount spent in China, but we have a rough sense, we have a guess of what it is. We have a good educated guess, and we invest a great amount more than China. And so there is a question of whether or not, China sends astronauts to the moon, taikonauts to the moon. Will that matter? Will we feel like we're in a space race? I think there are so many other factors at play, and how it matters for politics, and whether or not, this is something that's going to be of concern to Congress will be a big factor there. I also see there's a lot of interest in finding ways to collaborate in space. Space flight's very, very expensive. It's hard to justify the cost of something like we saw with the Apollo program. And we've worked really hard at international cooperation, even at that time, but even more so over time. And that helps us explore. So it's cost effective. We share expertise, and then we also build important relationships with other countries. And so I think that the priority is going to be in that direction more than competition. But things change rapidly, as we've seen this year with the International Space Station. So it's hard to predict what we'll see even next year.
Yeah, that was actually one of the questions I was going to have for you. And I'm curious whether or not you believe China might think differently. But
So with the Chinese program, from what I know, and I'm not an expert in this area, I've talked to experts who say that they're much more interested in their domestic audience. And that makes sense if you think about how much information you see about the Chinese space program. It's limited. They're not announcing launches like the United States does. They don't have this big public relations promotional campaign internationally. But there is an important role that the Chinese space program plays in domestic politics for them. And so I think a greater emphasis there is on sort of national identity, domestic politics, and less about necessarily what the United States is doing right now in space. But I could be wrong. I do focus on the 1960s. So take this all with that context.
all right, with that, if we can have another round of applause for our great speaker. All right, we have a great audience, and so we also have, unfortunately, a size limit on our roof. So what we're going to do is we're going to break you into groups, and we're going to take you up, and as people view through the telescope and come back down, we'll let people go up and see our observatory. So I hope you're going to be patient with us in that regard. Jonathan is, who I mentioned earlier, is staying over there. Patrick is also there, and I believe near the elevators, which is what you're going to be using to get up to the observatory. S is out there, one of our tour guides, and so with the three of them, they're going to work with you on getting you up there and showing you what we have in the observatory. Thank you very much, and I'll see you up there at some point. Thank you. That was fantastic.
Oh, good.
That was fantastic.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Great question. This crowd is unreal.
Yeah.
I can't believe so many people come out to an evening lecture.
Well, this is
At the end
actually
of the
our
semester.
largest crowd, and so yeah, I was impressed with it.
That's wonderful.
So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I could probably talk to you about it for hours, but and I know that, as you said, you specialize in the 60s, but with China, because particularly in the book that you mentioned, it didn't seem as if the Soviets. So we had this huge propaganda machine. It didn't seem like the Soviets really had something comparable, or if they did, they kind of stopped after, say, Gagarin and so forth. And so to me, there might be a parallel in, as you're saying, the Chinese aren't really advertising.
Yeah.
If I wonder if there's a sort of iron curtain that they're hiding behind, but behind, and they're not quite ready to open up.
Yeah, and also just different approaches to, information dissemination within those societies. The Soviet Union did have, some a lot of promotional material within the Soviet Union, and they did do the astronaut tours and things like that. So they definitely had public relations campaigns, but yeah, didn't share the same type of information and didn't, promote launches and all sorts of things like that. And then they ran into some issues with their lunar programs. So, but it'll be interesting to see how China might, if they stick to the same approach, or they might change over time as they get more successes. But it's considering that they have a space station now, like how many people in the US know that?
They just launched 3 Taikonauts. They just launched 3 of them to yesterday, I think it was.
Yeah, and it's an amazing accomplishment, and it's not something that seems to be
Widely known.
we're not the audience for it. I could be wrong, but I don't see it as people aren't quite as publicly aware of it as even what's going on with the Japanese space program, for instance. And that might be the relationship between the US and China, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see some of those differences.
Yeah, I was also quite surprised with, I'm not surprised by the strategy of becoming open, particularly considering the Soviets' closed off nature. But I am surprised in that they were willing to do it back in the Apollo, because I would imagine we are not so open now because of just the international relations. We don't want our technology getting usurped or what have you. So I was very much surprised by that the administrations were willing to actually put our technology out there for maybe the Soviets to replicate or take.
Yeah. And the idea was that, this is a free society. This is this embodies what a free society is and does. And I think to actually do a fair extent today, we still have that sense that an important part of, symbolizing and representing the United States is this kind of the sense of openness. And so there are the press that come to the launches, they explain the failures. So there's that kind of the sense of openness there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, I've got lots of questions that I don't want to hold you up. But yeah, and I think the other difference for me that I'm looking at is, maybe I don't know much about the 60s, but now NASA is in open collaboration with ESA, it's open collaboration with JAXA, as you said, the Chinese or the Japanese. It didn't seem like we were doing that in the 60s. So I think that might be a major change. I know you were saying that it was an international effort, particularly with tracking stations.
Yeah.
So
definitely. And the US we did have some cooperative programs with the Soviet Union throughout the 1960s. And there were things like sharing weather data. So things that were of low national security risk. But Kennedy, when he came into office, he thought space was going to be the way to improve relations with the Soviet Union. He offered to collaborate with Khrushchev twice. But from Kennedy to Johnson and Nixon, they had all these efforts to reach out to try to figure out ways that they could collaborate that wouldn't be of national security risk, but would still help improve relations between the countries and also be good for science. And so a lot of that was data sharing of things like weather data, which seemed a low risk. They also had an agreement about astronaut cosmonaut rescue. So there was throughout there's more important relationship than people realize, because we always focus on the race, but actually throughout the space race, and even in the 1980s when you have Reagan, you have Star Wars, there was still a collaboration going on between the US and Soviet Union in space. And now we're not doing anything with China. I mean, we have no space cooperation with China. And so it's actually much stricter now than it used to be. But there's a history to that because of this member of Congress who made sure that NASA was not collaborating with China.
I have a small short list of who that might be.
Wolf, from Virginia, actually.
Really?
Wolf, he's no longer a member of Congress, but he had lots of concerns about China, human rights abuses, lack of freedom of religion, and so he.
Oh wow! All right, I was thinking coming at it from the conservative perspective of USA and China needs to still have their place.
But it's a Wolf Amendment, so it's named after him, and prohibits space cooperation with China, and unless it's approved by Congress on a limited basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's surprising. Also surprising that we were actually collaborating with the Soviets in any real regard. Patrick, did you or